afternoon, and thank you for being in the session. Okay, and I'm just going to give you a quick brushstroke historical tour of Central American literature and culture, and it'll be more me talking, but I'm going to try to integrate maybe hopefully some discussion. Okay, please feel free to interrupt me at any time. Okay, and and a lot of this is following up on what we discussed earlier this morning. Yes? Okay. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about me. Ana Patricia Rodriguez. I'm an associate professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. Yay, Terps! Your turn?
I was, yeah.
Ah, okay. From the other side, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I am Salvadoran myself. I'm what they call I'm old now, okay, but once an immigrant, always an immigrant. So I'm what they call a 1.5er, meaning that you came as a child, and many of you have 1.5ers, people that come from like babyhood till about 18 years of age, okay? So, the year of arrival actually is really important. When you arrive, your connection to your culture, your languages and all that, right? So then it's a very important piece of me and what I do, and so a lot of what I do is informed by me being that kind of an immigrant. Also, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area because that's where my parents migrated before the Civil War. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about different waves of migration of Salvadorans and where they arrive. We're in a very particular area here, as the presenters this morning described, that this is an area that has a large migration of Central Americans today. It's the area in the United States that has probably the highest concentration, right, in one area. Los Angeles, of course, has the largest number of Salvadorans, Guatemalans, Hondurans, any Latino, right? It's always said that LA has the largest population of all Latinos, especially Mexicans, right? But DC, the DMV, is a very particular area that has had long migration of Central Americans, and it continues to have migration, as you're seeing the impact in your classes. And it is also said that the migration to this place is kind of particular. In the 80s, it was originating in rural parts of El Salvador, as opposed to where I grew up, San Francisco, that a lot of people tended to migrate there from the western part, the coffee producing areas, and the capital. Okay, so all that contributes to the way a community forms and adapts, and also mixes and fuses with the people around them, right? Okay, so in California, where I grew up, right, Salvadorans are often very Mexicanized. Okay, so I remember growing up and my parents saying, "Don't speak Mexican, right? Speak Salvadoran." But what did I know if I came age 5 and I'm absorbing everything around me, right? And so when I moved out here, it was interesting to me to see the fusion between African American and Salvadoran. Something that you see a lot in the San Francisco Bay Area, especially now with the gentrification, that African American population has plummeted to like 3% in that city, including Oakland across the bay. So anyways, right, the migrations are very particular, okay? And the histories from which we come are very particular, right? So I'm hoping here to give you like a crash course on Central American history and migration. But I want to start maybe with a question to you and asking you to come up with some questions, okay? So my question to you is, what questions do you have about Central America? Okay, especially, we learned a lot this morning, but I'm sure there's still a lot of questions that pertain to your classroom and the students that you are working with. So take about 5 minutes to think of 3 questions that you have.
I don't know much about it.
Can I get each group to report 1, 2, and if you have 3 and you want to report back 3 questions? Okay, and let's see if by the end of the session we can answer some of those questions. Or, I most definitely will not have all the answers, but you definitely will for them, okay? Why don't we start with this group here?
Well, we were just talking about something we learned in the morning session about families in Central America where the parents had come to the United States and the kids had been left in Central America, and then the kids end up coming years later, and kind of how those parents then readjust to having their child back in their life after, 7, 12 years or something. And we had heard that there was like a program in Fairfax County that was giving like parenting classes, but just how we as a county can, or as a school can work with some of those parents who are readjusting to life as a parent.
Okay. So how in your particular school address the needs of this community that might involve special programs or activities, especially around family reunification. And yes, I had not heard that Fairfax County has that program, and I teach in Prince George's County, and I'm not aware of programs in the county, but now I'm going to go find out, because I also work in the schools. I run an after school and English ESL program for parents at Hollywood Elementary and College Park, and these are the services that the university is being called to kind of supplement, right? Because there's a lot of need. So a need for programs that deal with family reunification and question mark. What do we do in your school? Okay, so addressing needs. Okay, what about this table?
We were talking really about how to reach out to the different populations of students who come from Central America, when in fact we learned this morning that second language is Spanish. So if they all have these different dialects, like how do you make them feel comfortable and feel like they're a part of the group when they can't maybe necessarily understand the language?
Okay, so the language needs beyond Spanish, right? Especially if there are communities or families that may not have Spanish, they speak indigenous languages. So how do you communicate with them? Good question. Any? Okay. What about you all there?
He asked what is the public education system like in Central America? How do they get to and from school? What does it look like? What is maybe like the age requirements?
Okay. So what does the public school education look like in a place like El Salvador? Age, you said something about transportation, right?
Yeah.
How do people get
To and from places and school.
Yeah, okay. And I was mentioning that, in some areas, especially, rural areas and areas that are very isolated, children may walk up to an hour and a half to school each way. Okay, so that can happen. Okay, so the public education system in El Salvador, good question. When does the school year begin, end? Right? What is that cycle? Does it coincide with our cycle here in the United States? Probably not. Okay, so good question. What about this table here?
Just going back to this morning, listening to the quotes from those children, the first thing that I felt on their behalf was, oh my gosh, PTSD. What resources are available for these populations to address this, especially in this political environment where they are afraid to trust people that they don't know. And so, and then bringing that down to what is our school system doing for this particular population with what's going on, and with the fear and the fact that, this summer one of our families was taken. So it just the question is, how can we help them address this PTSD?
That is a big consideration, right? And I would offer that in the Central American immigrant case, it's a very particular condition, right? And so that, we're being called more and more to address that, right? Especially if the biggest Latinx population in this area is Central American, right? What kinds of PTSD are they carrying? Why? And, and we're going to look at some of that history. And my hypothesis, my take on that is that It's just, not trauma that happened, in the life of one person, but it's residual trauma from, layers and layers and layers of violations and violent events. So any one family could be suffering trauma, like historical trauma, collective trauma, and then, the present. So it's pretty massive, right, to say the least. So how do we address that, right, in this particular cultural and historical context? It's not an easy question, right? So let's see if, we can pull together and think of resources that exist here. So I'm going to come back to that. Very important. What about your table?
My group and I came up with a question about the differences in dialects regionally between San Miguel or San Salvador or other parts of the country, and whether the differences in dialects affect English language acquisition. The difficulty in making certain sounds. I've had similar experiences with people who come from, children who come from parts of Guatemala using vos in vez de tú, but of course they say vos, the B sound instead of a V. So teaching people how to make the V sound, they've never realized that vos was spelled with a V, because analfabetos, it's very difficult to teach, and so I'm wondering if there's more information about the distinctions in dialects between the regions that will help me to get an insight into how to get them English as a second language or third language, as the case may be.
That's a good point, right? Because think of El Salvador, right, which I'm assuming is your largest Latinx, Latino population here, Spanish-speaking population, not Guatemalan.
That's safe to assume, I would say.
Safe to assume?
Yeah.
Like what we've been seeing in Prince George's County, University of Maryland is right outside of Langley Park. And I recently looked at some statistics of Langley Park. Langley Park, do you know where that is? It's right outside of the university, right on University Boulevard. It has the highest per capita per square mile concentration of immigrants in the whole country. And not just Central American, but people from Africa, people from the Caribbean, people from the Middle East, from Asia, etc. But Central Americans are the biggest group. But we've had a shift. And I've been hearing about this, but it's interesting to see the numbers that, historically the biggest number there was Salvadorans, and now it's Guatemalans. And a lot of the people, right, indigenous, who may have never spoken or learned Spanish in their country. So how do you teach ESL when, a lot of the programs, a lot of the teaching and learning, is through these other, more mainstream languages like Spanish, right? Okay? So I think we're having to rethink all that. And, for somebody who teaches teaching English as a second language, it's probably inventing and doing a lot of research on how to, address all that, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And pardon?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. And then add to that the levels of literacy. I like to not say like illiterate, but just, some people are not non-literate, or else a different kind of literacy, right?
Sure.
Because you may not be able to write, but you certainly can communicate and communicate in different ways, right? Even, in symbols and whatnot, right? So we're having to rethink all that, right? Which is not easy. And see, it comes with, this population, right? So, be and vos, like you just mentioned. Now, Salvadorans, they vocear, right? Great parts of Central America use vos, which is an informal use of tú, okay? But not all of them, right? So in Guatemala, it's mixed and whatnot. So how do you deal with that in a classroom context, right? The uses of those registers. Very complicated, right? Add to it, trying to teach English, okay? All right, good point, the part of language, okay? 2 tables over there.
Our first question piggybacked another table when we were asking about the public education system in Central America. Our second question was, in the last 5 to 7 years, just here in our area, we've seen an influx. And so what has caused that? What has happened in those past few years where all of a sudden the population is growing exponentially?
Okay, what has caused it and why is it continuing, right? I think the presentations this morning, kind of filled that in. What were some of the causes of the influx right now, based on the presentation that Dr. Hirschberg and Mr. Stinchcomb? Violence in Central America? Climate change, right? A lot of farmers are being completely displaced. And we know that in this area, you mentioned San Miguel, the eastern part of the country, that is historically the rural farming areas. And so there are droughts, water, access to water, lack of water is such a problem in a country like El Salvador, right? And so climate change is very significant. I don't think we discussed that earlier in the morning, but it's driving.
I was just curious why the DMV?
The DMV,
like,
okay.
Not Ohio, not
Not
like
Ohio.
Michigan, not like Massachusetts. I mean, just that was
This
my-
area,
Yeah.
by this area. Okay, so climatic and poverty and you all said violence and networking, corruption, all the factors that they mentioned today, right? Those are the drivers for migration in the present moment. But these drivers don't come out of nowhere, right? I mean, they have a history. So we have to think migration, and this is what I'm hoping to fill in, the larger context, right? Why is it that they came in the first place? Why the DMV, right? I mean, we got a lot of nice quotes and why people are coming here. But did we get a sense why? Why the DMV?
Maybe because here is easier to find jobs.
Okay, absolutely. One of the pull factors in all migrations, you have all the push drivers and push factors, right? Everything that you just mentioned and more. But the pull factor, given this context of social inequalities, given this context of lack of opportunities in the countries, which nothing new, right? Lack of access to education, to healthcare, climatic, all those reasons. Well, then on the other hand, there is a pull, and people are seeking opportunity, seeking to have gain or earn money. The pull factor is that there are jobs. Historically, there have been jobs in this area, right? Northern Virginia, think of the construction. Every time I come here, there's like construction, right? Right? Who constructs? If you go to those sites, we're the major, it's a major group that labors in that business. Central Americans, right? Restaurants, the service sector, hotels, who's in the back kitchen, right? Central Americans. Nannies, domestic workers, right? Persons doing the cleaning, right? Central Americanos, yes? And so there's certain jobs that, we have in this area that pull people, right? And so, up until recently, there's been growth in this area, right? Pulling people, right? So that's one of the reasons. And then history, because Central American Salvadorans aren't recent newcomers here. The history, if you're interested, there's a book by historian Terry Repack that talks about how Central Americans first started coming to this area. And I like to call it the classic mythology, right? So the classic myth is that, for all the Latin American and, another business that we didn't mention, this whole diplomacy thing. I mean, that is a business in this area, in the DMV, in the Washington, D.C. area, that you don't have in another part of the country, right? I grew up in San Francisco. When I moved out here, I was like, where are the, factories? Where are that kind of business, right? It's not. Diplomacy is an industry here. So it is said, part of the history is that migrants, people from other countries started coming, especially with the diplomatic corps, who brought, their housekeepers, nannies, service people, etc. And, that started to, pull in other people, like, if a mother came, she brought or a woman came, she brought other members of her family, or, you know what I mean? So people started arriving, and then that has become an enclave, right? And part of the pull here had been that diplomatic international aspect to Washington, the Washington D.C. metro area. That could be a story, right? That explains why people have come here. And once there's a group, right, and a social network is made possible, then usually people rely on that network that pulls in more people, right? More migrants, okay? So that happens in almost any city, right? But Washington, D.C. is very particular. And I always, like my big question always is, and we're going to talk a little bit about the politics and the U.S. and Central America, right? Which has had a very atrocious history, okay? My question, and a lot of people pose to me, is like, why would they come to Washington, D.C. when, all the agencies, when, all the policies were made here, when School of the Americas was designed here and trained military personnel to train military personnel in the countries that then caused a great part of the violence during the civil wars? Why would you come there, right? Once an enclave starts to form, it pulls in people, right? But there were other things in Washington, D.C. Churches. I mean, this area, D.C., has become a sanctuary, right? Although not, officially per se, but, there are some protections towards immigrants, okay? So that might be also a reason why people continue to come here, yeah? Okay, we're gonna continue to unpack that, right? But yes, D.C., attracted first migrants, and then the community has been growing, right? Okay, as opposed to, say, Mexicans in the Southwest and in California, which is their homeland, yeah? Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, you got both of ours. Because our other one was about the public education system in Central.
Okay, so that one, I may have to do some research on that one, okay? I may have some inkling, but it's a complex question. And this group right here?
Yeah, that was your one group.
Oh, you're one big group,
Yeah.
okay. Any other questions that are burning and are not, we're not, bringing them in? No, we're good? Okay, lots of good questions. Yeah? Keep them on hold, let's see if, we can answer them in what, we're gonna do. And if anything else comes up, okay, we're going to bring them up. So, we're just gonna, talk a little bit about some context. And I'm a literature teacher, actually, literature and culture. I teach in the Spanish department. So these issues of language acquisition and all that is very significant. And I talk a lot about history or literature in the context of history, right? And how literature is always responding, right, to the phenomenon, to what's going on. So I'm hoping to be able to walk you through some of the history and some of the literary responses and cultural responses, okay? So I, more or less, I'm hoping that, we can talk a little bit about the Central American history. I've given you a historical outline that I'm going to be referring to. It's probably history that a lot of you guys already know, okay? Also, I'm hoping to be able to talk a little bit about Central American literature from pre-Columbian, in other words, before Columbus, to the 21st century, and that's what this timeline or this bibliography is about. For anybody who's interested, I've compiled text, representative texts from Central America that you can kind of periodize from pre-Columbian to the present, and some electronic texts that on the internet. And then we want to look at histories of conquest, colonialism, U.S. imperialism, the role of the United States, dictatorships, globalization, transnationalism, that going back and forth. In the presentation today, Dr. Hirschberg very much talked about, right, the connections that the communities here have with the context, right? Transnational community that goes back and forth, that sends money, that's connected. And then we want to talk about the communities that are now formed here, right? Diasporic communities. in this area, the Washington DC area, we have Salvadorans and other Central Americans that are going on like 3 generations, 4 generations, like, you know, great-great-grandparents that have been here since, you know, the turn of the century and are, you know, having children and, you know, grandchildren and so forth, right? So I'm trying to also demystify the idea that Central Americans are new. There are records that show that in the United States, in the whole area, that early on in the Spanish conquest, that peoples, indigenous peoples from Central America were literally taken, extracted from their homelands and transported as enslaved indigenous peoples and taken to other places, including California, to rebuild the ships, the caravels of the Spaniards. So, you know, it would be important to trace that history, right? That, you know, people have been on the move forcefully a lot of times from way back, right? There's records that show that there were Salvadoran miners in the California gold rush, okay, so back to the 19th century. So the movement has been constant and historical, okay? And then, you know, we want to look at, or I'd like to just present you with, you know, maybe some theories of reading Central American literature. If we get there or not, that's fine. And then looking at, in the current context, what literature or what literary production might look like, okay? So Dr. Hirschberg today mentioned some of the issues that Central Americans face, some of the crises, right? So among them, right, violence. We've been talking about trauma, impunity, where a lot of the injustice and the violence that happened, especially during the civil wars, was never brought to trial or to justice, and so there's a lack of seeking justice, right, for the peoples of Central America, so that's a big issue. The issue of memory, trying to remember where you come from, trying to remember what happened, trying to record it, archives are important themes. Crime, right, the crimes, the human rights violations that continue, and immigration. These are constant themes in the literature of the present. And then if we get there, like looking maybe as a case study, the literature of what today was identified as a Northern Triangle. What's the Northern Triangle? What did the presentation in the morning say about that? Was that what countries?
Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala.
In Guatemala, okay? Northern Triangle. A totally artificial term, okay? Created by the State Department to, you know, identify those countries with all those issues. Also a category that is highly exploited by the media today. Do you hear it circulate in the media? Like in 6 o'clock news or Reports on Centroamérica? Is that a term that you've heard before? Or was it kind of, for you, you've heard it, was it a familiar term to the rest of you? Yeah? Okay. The Northern Triangle, right, of Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador. Okay. Used to classify that area with these things associated with it, right? And a long history of social inequality, of all sorts of things, including U.S. interventions. Okay, and so we want to look at that, and then I'm just gonna, you know, have you think along. We probably won't get to that, but making it relevant to what you do here. My understanding is that you have a large population of Central American students, newcomers that might have come yesterday, or they're going to come to your class on Tuesday, right? And then kids that, you know, you had last year, but, you know, are also new to the United States, right? And then ELs, English language learners, mixed with, you know, other, you know, students who've been here longer. Okay, so it's I can't imagine. It's very complex, right? You have a whole population that's very mixed, right? And so I think part of the challenge and part of what we're doing here is trying to think how we can, first of all, address all that, respond to all, you know, all the issues and challenges the children bring with them, a system with issues like post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Trauma. I was just at Mother Jones Elementary School in Maryland, Adelphi, and the teachers there. That school is 91% Latino. A great number of them is the ELs. I'm still pondering that 91%, right? Okay? And they were telling me everything that I'm hearing from you right now, they also were talking about, right? The post-traumatic stress, the trauma, all sorts of things, right? The separation anxiety, right? The vice principal was telling me of cases where the children, given, that they've been separated from the parents or grandparents, and on the first day of school they're going to separate again from, home, okay? So they were telling me of cases where, the kids are holding on to the door, they can't, they don't want to stay. So they were asking, and they have been very creative in trying to address that, right? How to not add trauma to trauma, right? Because you're gonna rip a kid, from his parents or her parents. I mean, that's gonna have an effect, right? So they said that, their immediate response was to do just that. Oh, parent, goodbye. We'll deal with it, right? But it's been very hard. So one of the things that they've been doing is they did a staggered introduction to school. So first, visiting the school, come check out the classroom with the parents, but nobody stays, right? And then slowly they, have them stay until they stay, okay? Sometimes, that must be done, right? In order to be able not to, add more stress or more anxiety to the situation. So I don't know if you have that kind of situation, but, has anybody experienced anything like that?
I've had a lot of children, like a couple from the Dominican Republic that had really strong bonds with their family members and would cry for about the first hour of school. And it just continued for months, or the counselor or somebody would bring them in and say, well, they've been here, they're here, don't mark them absent, but we're just trying to get them to calm down.
Right, so it makes you think, that there is an added, there's something added there, right? Added trauma. So the things that you're having to deal with are very particular to this population, right? And I'm glad you brought up Dominican, people from the Dominican Republic, because oftentimes, they don't get discussed, right? And Dominicans, have a very challenging time coming to the United States. Some of them cross, do a perilous journey through the channel, right, to Puerto Rico and here, or else, many of them come undocumented as well, right? And there's, certain traumas. A lot of, Latino populations or migrant populations, even though they're not Central Americans, they're having to make that perilous trip, right, through Mexico. I have volunteered at a detention center, at the Dilley Family Detention Center in South Texas near San Antonio, preparing migrants who are seeking asylum for the credible fear interviews. I thought I was going to encounter Centroamericanos, right? And I was there as an interpreter, okay? In that week, we had Dominicans, we had Cubans who had crossed the water, had come all the way through Venezuela, up and crossing Venezuela, right? Up through Colombia, through Panama, through Nicaragua, all the way to the border. We had people from the Congo, right? French speakers. We had Cameroonians. We had Haitians, okay? So it's the whole world passing through, and if you've been following the news, I'm sure you've seen, I think they were from Cameroon, and, they were just, on limbo, on hold at, was it El Paso or some, the other side, at the border, right, on the Mexican side. So anyways, this experience is not only Central American, right, that passage through Mexico. So we never know what of our children have had that experience, right, so the trauma of all that, right. Added the trauma to coming to school, being new at a new place, right? That's trauma enough, right? So I'm hearing that post-traumatic stress, trauma, separation anxiety, all that is very particular, and you're now experiencing all that in classrooms, maybe to a higher extent than in the past, right? So we're being called to find solutions for that, right? So so I think, you know, and I think Teaching for Change would agree that literature is a good way of kind of opening a space to be able to, you know, bring stories out, okay? So I want you to think, you know, we don't have to write anything down right now, but think ahead, because, you know, you might need to do in your classes. How would you develop, you know, a lesson plan around, given this context that you're experiencing, given the things that you think you want your children to learn, your students, what kinds of outcomes you need them to have, especially in, you know, language acquisition. You know, you need them to learn English in order to be able to pass the grade or to take the test, the standardized test, okay? And be able to, you know, learn throughout the semester, right? So how we can use literature in order to, you know, be able to make headway on that. And then, you know, as in all lesson plans, what kind of materials, time logistics, and added challenges we might be having, right? So if we have time, probably not. But think in your minds, what would you do, right? Maybe at the end somebody might want to offer like, oh, I think I would want to do this, and this is how I would do it, and these are the outcomes I'd like to have. Okay? So just throwing out there that keep that mulling in the back of your heads. Yeah? And of course, you know, there's a lot of materials, and right now the other session is discussing literature. Okay? But I'm just going to put out there's lots of stuff that deals with this migration. I don't know if you're familiar with the book Somos las Nubes, We Are Like the Clouds. That is precisely about unaccompanied minor child migration. And for those of you who have the attachment, the samples of literature, at the end there's, I photocopied 2 pages from that book that have beautiful illustrations, right? About, and poems that the author of Boca Quieta has written about the child migrant experience. So, you know, there might be a possibility of this, you know, reading those with kids and having a discussion or seeing what kinds of stories might come out, okay? But always, I think, in my experience working with teachers, I think under working with people who can assist in the trauma piece, counselors, or I think we have a social worker here, yeah, because obviously re-traumatization could be an issue, yeah. But there's plenty of literature that deals with Central America, children's literature, plenty. There is not a vacuum, okay? So I think a lot of these are at the website for Teaching for Change, so if you're looking for resources, there's a lot of stuff out there. But I just wanted to bring your attention, right, like the series here about migration through Mexico. So migration on the bestias, on the trains, the voices of children, but, you know, represented through less traumatizing modes. Like, for example, in this story, Two White Rabbits. Is anybody familiar with this book? It's a story of a father and a daughter, a young daughter, and they're making the trek. And there's only one word that signifies Salvadoran here. What's the word for dog in Salvadoran Spanish?
Perro.
Perro, that's the standard. But if you were to hear cachorros, more like South America. But, you know, I'm always, because, you know, since I teach Spanish, I'm always looking for the signal words, and I can say like, Peru, Salvador, Guatemala. Chucho.
No.
Chucho.
Yeah.
Pero,
Oh.
yeah, chucho for perro, dog. But chucho also, if somebody calls you a chucho, you don't want to be called a chucho. What does that mean? It's not a bad word.
A mutt.
But generally, yeah, dogs, mutts, but chucho in general. You could have a German Shepherd, and, you know, they're going to call him a chucho. Well, if somebody calls you a chucho, And of course, you know, there's also verbal language or sign language, right? Somebody calls you a chucho.
Selfish.
It's somewhere in there. Cheap. You're cheap, right? You just don't spend money. And in some contexts, it can be a good thing, right? You're very economical, and right. In other cases, it could be selfish. You don't like to share, right? Okay. So you all have the challenge too, that if you have a diverse population of Central Americans, you're going to have different variations of the Spanish, right? So you're Guatemaltecos, Salvadoreños, Hondureños, right? The name for children. The name for children varies across almost many places. Niños y niñas.
Chavales.
Chamales?
Chavales.
Chavales?
I
Where?
don't know.
Como chavo, chava en México.
Chavo, chava en México, el chavo del ocho. Right?
Muchachos.
Okay, so muchachos, muchachas,
Chicos.
muchachitos, muchachitas.
Patojitos.
Okay, here we come. Here we start.
I don't know that.
Okay, so patojo. If you hear your parents say patojo, patoja, what's patojo in what country?
Well, pato means duck. Duckling is patojito, so I would say that it's Guatemala.
Guatemalteco.
Good.
Automatically, you know, Guatemala. Okay? Muchachos, muchachas, muy general, muchachitos, muchachitas. Bicho, bicha. Now, if you use that word, yeah,
Good is
it's-
a good word.
in Argentina, not good. Okay? Pero en El Salvador, mira, bichito, bichita. ¿Usted? ¿Ah? Okay, so bichito, bichita in El Salvador, children, niños y niñas, okay? And it's like the slang term. It's if you go to El Salvador, that mira bichito, mira bicho, okay?
Yeah.
But if you go to Argentina, no, that's going to be not good. It's like a word for genitalia, okay? Okay. Or it could also mean bicho, a bug, insect, okay? All right, so it makes us try to be careful also with the words we use with our families, right? Okay, so patojo, Guatemala, bicho, bichita, more slang in El Salvador, pero the big word in El Salvador for children, this one I think you might have heard. Cipote, cipota,
Yeah.
no? Okay, cipote, cipota. And they come from like indigenous languages, right? Okay? In Honduras,
But I have something to say. I think that it's good to use the right word because we don't want to have problems. If we say something that the family says, well, I can say that to my children, but no the teacher.
sure.
That's my opinion sometimes.
So there is, you know, standard English, niños y niñas, muchachos y muchachas, that could also be used, yeah? So cipote, cipotas, girls and boys. In Costa Rica, there's a very interesting word that's very Costa Rican, huijas, algo así.
I don't know.
Okay, I lived in Costa Rica for my graduate program, and it's just this beautiful word. You're like, oh, okay, right? And what's the other word? Oh, chavalos, chavalas, Nicaragua. Chavala, chaval. Okay. So, anyways, this is just a symbol of how you're dealing with a lot of registers of Spanish, right? And a lot of reading the signs, right? So I always like to cue my students and say, follow the parents' lead, follow your audience's lead, right? First of all, what they want to call themselves, right? That's important. For example, Latino, Latina. Now we're using the term Latinx to represent non-binary. In other words, we want to deconstruct the notion that there are only two genders and two sexualities, right? Male, female. So then Latinx leaves it's the spectrum, okay? So I teach Latino, Latina, Latinx studies, so we're using that term. Hispanic, some people use the word Hispanic, Hispano, in Espanol, and then Latino, Latinx, see? Okay. So all those, take the lead of the parents, of your group, okay? So we have the resources here. So think about a lesson plan that you might want to maybe develop, okay? Given your population. and then hopefully we can come back to that. So Central America, and here I'm just gonna start a little bit of the historical. Turn again to your group, and we ask questions, right? So think of Central American history, whatever you know, even if it's recent history. Maybe some of the things you learned today. But three things about Central American history. Maybe we can that way piece it together. In the United States, we don't know much about Central America, right? I mean, I'm Central Americana, but I wasn't born with that knowledge, right? So I had to learn it. So what is it about this place? I like to ask my students, what's an isthmus? Isthmus, right? This strip of land between two oceans and two continents, okay? So Central America is one of like 2-3 isthmuses in the world, okay? And it was formed by volcanic eruptions that then formed land masses and created this land bridge. So Central America has always been a bridge for the crossing of animals, flora, plants, insects, people, economies flow, right? And so in the morning, they told us that now there's a flow of narcotráfico and drugs and all that, right? Well, I mean, if you got to get to North America and you're in the south, you can go by sea or you can go land train through Central America, right? So an isthmus connecting that. So what other facts do you have? We started with you. We're going to start over there. What if you can name maybe one or two things that we know about the history or the region?
We know that it's high poverty area. We know that there is a high rate of crime there.
Okay. So, okay, and that's okay, high poverty, and what was the first one?
Crime.
Crime, okay.
We know it was destabilized by the United States first of all, in Europe, and then Russia, through the School of the Americas and then other factions, mostly trained by the United States.
Okay, my favorite topic. not that favorite that happened, but it's an important history that oftentimes we kind of skip over in the United States. Exactly. So it's an area heavily intervened by the United States from way back in Cuba, from way back 19th century, not before, into the present, right? Mm-hmm. And the migration that we have right now is a direct result of all that, right? And we're just continuing that, intervention in a different form. So we want to get back to that and have some specifics. Yes, an area of a lot of intervention, right? Not only by the U.S., but by other colonial powers. Mm-hmm. Great Britain. I heard, during the Cold War, the ideology of communism and capitalism, right? The colonial powers during the 19th century. So we'll get back to that. Okay, very good. Anything else from that table? 3. Got it. Okay. What about you? This table.
Well, we kind of, as a group, kind of realized that we didn't learn much about Central America and South America in school growing up.
Okay. Fair enough.
Other than the Panama Canal was built.
Yeah.
At some point I remember reading something about that in world history in high school.
Okay. Panama Canal, which connects to what that table said, and we got to connect it to the U.S.
There's a couple of countries that kind of from the east, they had an east coast where slave trade stops back in the day.
Absolutely right. The Atlantic, Caribbean, right? First that we're going to talk about British colonization. We're going to talk about enslavement. We're going to talk about African descent peoples and diverse peoples with different languages, cultures being subjugated in this area, okay? And how Central America virtually, not that it's literally divided by a political line, but there is a cultural divide here, right? That area and this western part, and explains a lot why in Salvador
But they've been primarily export economies.
Export economies, okay,
Their
so,
agricultural livelihoods have been decimated through free trade agreements.
right.
And that's part of one of the pull factors for migration.
Right, when, you know, there isn't, production and capital has been expropriated, including natural resources, migration also is an effect of that, right? So, yes, historically, an export economy, mono agriculture, one crop, and the mono agricultural crops have been historically, there has been sugar, not to the extent of the Caribbean that, you know, enslaved so many people, but banana production, so we wanna talk about banana production. The United Fruit Company, right? The importation of, Caribbean labor, West Indies, Santa Lucia, Barbados, that whole area. In other words, you know, black migrant labor, especially in the 19th century. So, banana production, coffee, sugar, cotton, right? Okay, export economies. Good point. So I love that. We need to know more, right? Okay. What about you all here?
Spanish may not be the first language for some of the more rural parts of these countries.
Okay. So that it's a very multilingual area, region. Spanish, in some places, a dominant language, but of course there are a variety of indigenous language, plus also African languages, plus Creoles, mixed, you know, languages, and French. I mean, all sorts of language. So multilingual. What's the official language of Belize?
English.
English, right? Okay. What's the official language of Guatemala? Spanish. Despite the fact that there are 23 and 63% of the population is indigenous, that 23, and I like to say languages, indigenous languages, because Maya, there's an Maya, one Maya language, but there's one Maya, like Quiche, is not understood by Cachiquel speakers and, you know, all the different languages, right? So 23, so it's a multilingual country, but Spanish is the official and dominant language, okay? So multilingual, multidiverse, multiracial, okay? Good. What about you?
It's used as a gateway for other countries to also travel through to get to North America.
Absolutely, right? So we have all that wave of people coming, okay? I did some research way back. In 1999, I went to the reception centers of deportees, and I met a Nigerian brother and sister and friend were being held at the center in San Salvador, and I'm like, how did you get here? Without speaking the language, but they had early on been doing that trip, okay? Ms. Table, did I get you off? It's 3 minutes, okay?
Yes, so then they need 5 minutes to write their evaluation.
Okay, great. And you all? One thing.
Garifunas and the Mosquito Coast.
Garifunas, one of the Afro descent populations in the
Mosquito Coast.
Mosquito Coast, so Nicaragua here and San Pedro Sula, okay? So a big diversity of peoples here. Okay. So with that, with everything you all said, we know a lot. We actually know a lot, right? Pulling it together, our information. So I'm leaving you here with this timeline, okay? That is something I use with my students, like when I start Central American culture and lit class, in order to, you know, kind of produce a mapping of the history in Central America. And what I want you to know is what our compañera at that table said, that there are so many historical moments when the U.S. has intervened in Central America. In the 19th century, William Walker, the filibuster, invited by a political party to Nicaragua, he went to Nicaragua to assist them, and he ended up taking over the country in 1856, declaring himself president, English as the official language, changing the constitution, ruled in Nicaragua for like 3 years. The Central Americans all came together, the Central American campaign from different countries to push him out. and finally he was executed in Honduras. But he was about going into Nicaragua, appropriating Nicaragua, and the eventual idea was that Nicaragua was going to become a slave state of the United States. Imagine that, right? So that's one of the big interventions. And then throughout history, banana production, turning this whole area into banana production. If anybody's interested, I just discovered a video on Amazon Prime called When Banana Ruled, that tells you the story about banana production. And then you see the independence of Panama, the U.S. orchestrating, taking, arranging the independence in 1903. And then you see the training of military personnel in the School of the Americas in Panama. And then, I'll finish. And then into the 1950s with a coup d'etat that the United States funded and organized in Guatemala that led to the Civil War. Longest civil war in the Americas from 1954 to 1996. Massacre, genocide of indigenous peoples, and then the wars in Central America funded again, right, by the United States, et cetera, right, to 1999. I want to leave you with the thought that the trauma that we began talking about is not a trauma just about the migration yesterday or today or tomorrow. It's embedded in this longer history of being pushed out of your country, of your country being, conquered, right, by imperial forces, and the need to seek opportunities to seek life. Actually, to survive, having to leave, right, which is the history, great part of the history of Centroamericanos. So this is the larger history, right? How do we teach that? How do we, our children may not know that, right? We can't expect them to know that if none of us knows that, right? But how do we instill in them, like the need to learn, right? So that I'm always gratified in college when a student will come and say, I don't know anything about my history, like a Latino or another person or a Central, and says, I want to learn, right? And so I think the seeds are planted with you in this and here, right, where the kids begin to honor their culture, their history, their background, right, and are willing to learn more. So that's the message. I think the point that I want to leave you with, that you've got a lot of challenges, a lot of important work to do, but the seeds are laid here, right? So I'm pretty grateful, right, because when I get a kid who says, I want to learn more, yes, welcome. And all those books that I showed you earlier are part of the seeds, right? So thank you very much, and I could go on forever.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm leaving you with that bibliography, and some of you have example texts if you want to read more of Central American literature. Okay? All right. Muchas gracias.